Hello, good morning from New York. Sorry about that. Didn't know when to start. My name is Melissa Silverstein. I am the founder and publisher of Women in Hollywood. I'm also the co-founder and artistic director of the Athena Film Festival. And I'm very excited to be with you this morning to moderate this block, which we are calling The Interrupters. These are going to be women who saw issues and tried to make change, and they are going to talk about the work that they've done and why it's so vital to our culture and how we are going to change the industry by interrupting it. Okay, so first up here, we have Dorte Rømer. Are you here? I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Great, good to see you. You're going to be, okay. Dorte is a Danish actress with a wide variety of experiences in Scandinavia and the UK. She has been active in safety issues on sets since her debut in the business before it became the vogue thing to be in the MeToo movement. In 2017, she was a strong voice in the MeToo movement and has since continued to work for better and safer conditions on sets, stage, and screen. In 2019, she was the Danish representative at the Nordic Council meeting, focusing on the consequences of speaking up and harassment in public. And let's just remember, it's never easy to be out there and speaking up about things that people do not want to hear. So, Dorte, why don't you give us your take? You are muted. You're muted.
Am I here now?
Now I can hear you. Great.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to open this segment of the Carla 2020 conference. My name is Dorte Rømer, and I'm an actress born in Denmark, trained in Scotland. If you get the part, just know that he'll try to get into your pants. Just make sure that you're never alone with him in rehearsals or dressing rooms. This is a piece of advice I've been whispered by fellow actresses over many years, in many countries, and in various versions. And I was careful. Never flirty, never inviting. I eased out of situations smoothly, left the party like Cinderella before midnight, always sober, always alert, always with my professional persona rather than my festive real me. And yet, time after time, I experienced groping, unwanted sexual advances, abuse, threats, and attempted rape. Whilst being sober, dressed, and in a work situation at my workplace. I knew this wasn't my fault. It wasn't a charming gesture from a director. It was a power struggle, and it was physical. And I finally had enough. For years, I had protected and assisted my fellow female colleagues. But finally, I decided to speak up for myself. And I decided to put my name and my face to the story. This was in 2007. It was when the Danish Actors Association published a paper on sexual harassment. And 30% of its members stated that they had been subjected to sexual harassment, retaliations, coercion, and rape. And the aftermath was silence. I got fired when I reported the attempted rape. When the hashtag MeToo swept the world 10 years later, hundreds and thousands of stories arose. My fellow female colleagues in the Danish film, television, and stage business told anonymously of countless episodes and the stress, the laughing stock, the ridicule, the silencing, and how they left the industry entirely as a result. But this time, the aftermath was not silence, but action, and proof that each and every one of us can be a part of a positive development for more equality and fairness. A Danish male writer who experienced harassment wrote, "There are two ways to falsify history. One is to tell a lie. The other is to prohibit others from sharing their story. The first one is intolerable. The other one is fascism. So where do we go from here? The men who threatened me, and still unfortunately do today, for speaking up, threatened to rape me, butcher me, sabotage and kill me and my family. I want to avenge by speaking up, staying in the business and continuously working for a better working environment where men and women, all genders, shapes, colours and sizes, together can explore and extend the passion we're willing to die for, the life as an actor and as a creator of living art, films and performances. Intimacy coaches now support a new approach to our business, and I welcome them. I do not believe in the element of surprise when doing intimate scenes. When we do stunts, we don't throw an actor off a cliff with the words, "I want to see real fear." No, don't underestimate the skills of us. We've trained for years in acting emotionally to words and actions as if it was a very first time for us. We have to support code of conducts and we have to live up to them. At the Nordic Council Summit in Stockholm, the Finnish and Swedish ministers of equality emphasizes that we also have to protect the silence breakers from retaliations. Ombudspersons who report irregularities often targeted themselves. We have to stand together with a firm demand, not only to say we want change and want to change an outdated system, but we have to support and stand by the decisions to improve, and we have to stand together. The business is hard enough as it is. We are driven by passion and ambition. Let us demand that the business and unions also live up to our standards as diverse and qualified women, but above all, colleagues. Thank you very much from Copenhagen.
Thank you for that incredibly powerful introduction. And I want to thank you for your leadership on this. It means so much to all of us.
Thanks.
Stay safe. Let us know if you need any help. We're here for you.
Oh, I need it.
Okay. Anytime. Okay, so up next, thank you again, Dorte. That was really moving. Next up, we are going to have Karen Boyle. She is going to give a short keynote, and then she will have a conversation with my co-moderator, Johanna Koljonen. So Karen Boyle, the author of MeToo, Weinstein and Feminism, a book that has gone to the top of my list of to read. It provides a feminist analysis of MeToo and the sexual assault allegations against celebrity perpetrators, which have emerged since the Weinstein story of October 2017. Her argument explores the media depiction of feminism and feminists in the wake of Weinstein and the cultural values associated with men's abuse, particularly within the film and television industries. Karen, are you here?
I am indeed.
Okay, great. Take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for that introduction, Melissa, and thank you, Dorte, for getting this session off to such a great start. I want to start my remarks today by briefly reflecting on the title of this session, If You Don't Interrupt It, You Allow It. Because I think this poses a really useful provocation about whose responsibility it is to end sexual harassment and abuse. My own research has most recently focused on both social media and legacy media responses to the Weinstein case and the wider discourse around the MeToo hashtag. And this does give me slight pause in thinking about whose responsibility it is to interrupt, to speak out, and ultimately end sexual harassment and abuse. And whilst I'll argue that we do all have a role to play, I want to preface this by asserting that the ultimate responsibility for abuse always lies with the perpetrator. Now, since the New York Times story of October 2017, I'm sure we've all heard and read time and time again that everybody knew about Weinstein, that his behaviour was an open secret, that he was hiding in plain sight. And I think one of the unfortunate implications of the way this story has been more widely taken up is that it far too easily slips into victim blaming. Given what everybody knew, why did she agree to go to his hotel room? I can't tell you how many times I've read or heard that question. And it shifts responsibility, presenting his behaviour as inevitable and making it the responsibility of others to stop it. And you see that too in meme culture, which is focused on what prominent female friends of Weinstein's knew or didn't know, something that's raised its head again this week, with Weinstein trending on Twitter in the aftermath of Michelle Obama's convention speech. Her opponents foregrounding her historical remarks about Weinstein being a wonderful human being and a good friend as a way of undermining her current credibility. And what concerns me about both these examples is that it makes men's abuse a story about women's culpability. There's a link between victim blaming and broader women blaming that we need to be cautious of, while at the same time being willing to be critical of complicity, including our own. As Victoria Thomas talked about this morning, how do we hold ourselves accountable? Yet despite the fact that everybody apparently knew, when the Weinstein story broke, it was widely portrayed as shocking, surprising, and dependent on people breaking the silence. Indeed, Time magazine, as I'm sure you know, named the MeToo silence breakers their person of the year in December 2017. And a group of Weinstein survivors also used this term to present themselves outside the New York courthouse during Weinstein's trial, which gives me pause to remember it was actually at the beginning of this year. It's been such an odd year. So how do we reconcile these two apparently opposing viewpoints? That everybody knew about this behaviour, and yet there was a silence around it which had to be broken. And I should say that this is by no means unique to the way the story of the Weinstein case has been told. And prior work I'd done, for instance, on coverage of the Jimmy Savile case in the UK found very, very similar patterns. What changed wasn't necessarily that women broke the silence. As Dorte has already reminded us, many of these women told their stories decades before, and indeed in some cases had made complaints or gone to the police. The silence wasn't necessarily personal, but it was political. It was not always an absence of speech, but an absence of recognition. So what changed? Well, at least three things. One, that individual stories were collectively linked, not least by the affordances of social media. Secondly, that the stories were recognised as stories of abuse. And thirdly, that the men at the heart of these stories were often no longer in positions of the same power as they had been. Now, I'm not really going to talk about this last point. I want to focus on the first two. And I'll start by saying something about collectivity. Because a central problem I've found with much of the MeToo discourse as it's been taken up in mainstream media is its lack of historicisation. Women have been speaking out for decades. They have been doing so collectively for decades. And feminist organisations have been working to support and advocate for victims and survivors and to challenge perpetrators and the institutions which have supported them for decades. Now, this was acknowledged to an extent in mainstream discourse around MeToo when it was linked to the wider MeToo movement founded by Tarana Burke. That movement was itself a response to and development of a longer-standing feminist movement against men's violence, which had unevenly considered the experiences of the Black and brown women that Burke worked with. Burke's own reflections on the way in which her contribution has been acknowledged in mainstream media discourse are significant here, however. She suggests that she's been acknowledged as a founder, but not as a leader. And her experience as a founder is linked to her experience as a survivor. Now, I don't want to minimise this, of course. Survivors are also activists. But it's the fact that it's the personal and not political, which is the focus of mainstream media interest, that I think is problematic. And this is emblematic of a wider problem in news discourse, where the ongoing work of activist and specifically feminist organisations is largely invisible. And it's certainly not visible as a source of expertise. In my research focusing on coverage of the Weinstein case, for instance, I found very, very few mentions of organisations like RAIN or Rape Crisis, though they clearly could have put what was happening into a broader context and provided signposting to support for survivors in the audience. Again, this pattern is not unique to the Weinstein case. We're seeing it at the moment in coverage of the Epstein case too. Time's Up has in lots of ways provided opportunities to link the MeToo discussion into that wider history. But in terms of mainstream media responses, there's still a tendency to present feminism as an opinion rather than a knowledge base and source of expertise. And I was really thinking of this listening to Tabitha Jackson's opening comments yesterday, when she talked as though it's only our knowledge that seems to be situated, not all knowledge, and we need to acknowledge that. And it's a problem. And partly it's a problem because it continually puts the onus back on survivors to personally speak out. Now, I would never want to detract from the power and importance of survivor speech. We owe the survivors of MeToo a huge debt. But speaking out should never be an imperative. Survivors do not owe us their speech, and we have decades worth of speech we can draw on already to envisage a way forward. I did a piece of work looking at how feminism was presented in coverage of the Weinstein case in the English language press. And when I looked at the Time's Up launch, I was really disappointed to find that, for instance, while the activists who attended the Golden Globes and the organisations they worked with were widely named, they were not directly quoted, and nor was the nature of their work considered. This is not a criticism of those women, rather it's to highlight the missed opportunities to make this part of a wider conversation. But of course, if the news and entertainment media won't do it, we can, and we do. We can and do educate ourselves about these ongoing histories, share information, raise profiles, and signal boost their work. We can all help change the landscape so we don't lose sight of those histories and that knowledge again. And so survivors don't have to keep speaking publicly again and again for us to understand the necessity of change. Now, I want to move on to the second point, that women's stories were there, but weren't recognised as stories of abuse. As I've said, the problem wasn't necessarily that women had been silent. The problem was that what happened to them was not, or what was done to them, I should say, was not recognised as problematic. And one factor here was their status relative to that of their abusers. They simply didn't matter enough for this to become a substantive issue. Their abusers had more power and, crucially, more credibility. Now, in my book, I go into a longer argument about this in relation to the sexualised history of women in the film industry. The women who tried to speak out about Weinstein, both before and after October 2017, found that their credibility was often at stake because of the sexualised nature of the industry in which they worked or aspired to work. Yes, Weinstein had professional power, but at least as importantly, he had a credibility the women didn't by virtue of his gender and the long history of the sexist sexualisation within the industry in which he worked. To be clear, to argue that film acting is a sexualised position for women is not a value judgment. It's to illustrate the double bind in which women working in film were caught. Their success often depends on their sexualisation, yet that undermines the seriousness with which they're judged, not only as artists, but also as victims and survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse. And I'm really interested to hear later whether intimacy coordinators can be part of just breaking that open. Now, the abuse wasn't seen as abuse, but as something else. Think of the way the casting couch has long been part of Hollywood's mythology and indeed its glamour to the outside world. Linked to this, we have the auteur apologist narrative, that these kind of abuses are to be expected given the artistic sensitivities and temperaments of men in the business. Or in Weinstein's case, given that we'd struggled to think of him as an auteur, it's to be expected in successful business. This is the kind of ruthlessness required, not taking no for an answer, being persistent, dogmatic. And I'm I find that every time I sort of think of this, I also recall something like Trump's The Art of the Deal. So it wasn't rape, it was an addition. It was an opportunity. It was a calculated risk. It was just Harvey being Harvey. For the abuse to have continued without significant consequence until October 2017, required the cultural normalisation of men's sexual violation of women. And that cultural normalisation functioned as an alibi for abusive men like Weinstein, not least by rendering so many others complicit. This is what a rape culture looks like. However, in my writing about the Weinstein case, I've shied away from the term rape culture because I think it's actually about something more than that. It's about the historical, cultural value of abuse for the film industry. The everybody knew narrative suggests that sexual and sexualized abuse has not just been tolerated in the industry, but has been consistent with the stories the film industry has often wanted to tell about itself. And those stories have sold. They've sold newspapers, magazines, biographies, as well as the films themselves. They've also been normalised in certain strands of film studies. One of the notable things about the Hollywood MeToo stories is how many relied on material which had been in the public domain for some time, often in biographies, interviews, or celebratory accounts of the making of particular films. They were there, they were acknowledged and embraced as part of the culture of making great films and producing great performances. In my wider work, I've come across countless examples of this, and perhaps the most insidious is when men's abuse of women is presented as the enabler of women's success. It brings out the strong performances. It helps women win awards. And I think this echoes what we heard from Dorte earlier. Women's success is something that is done to them. In Brave, Rose McGowan says of method acting, and I quote, "I have never met a female method actor. To me, I'm a method actor is usually synonymous with I'm going to be a fucking dick to everybody on set. I've never been on a set where that bad behaviour wasn't indulged." End quote. Indulged, not tolerated. It's woven into the fabric of how the film industry has for too long thought about itself and how it has been valued and admired. And that's the wider reckoning which MeToo has initiated. But we've still got a long way to go. What can we do? Well, over the course of the weekend, you'll hear a lot of important and practical work which is already being done. What I want to add to that is a call for us all to think about how we can devalue abuse. This is not just about working practices. It's also fundamentally about representational practices. Whose stories we believe, whose stories we foreground, the euphemisms we use to disguise the realities of violence and abuse, what we take to be the measures of success and how we talk about those who we believe to be the experts, whose histories we know, share and respect. In short, you can't end sexual harassment unless you end gender inequality, representationally as well as materially. Individual survivors, creatives and feminist organisations have been doing that work for decades. There's still more to do and more to learn. And the conversations this morning really reflected on that, I think. We will get things wrong and there are things we don't know yet, but we are not starting from scratch. We know things and we know people who know things. And that means we can change things. And I'll end my remarks there.
I think I'm going to come back. Can you hear me, Karen?
I can, Melissa, yeah.
Okay, great. I'm going to come back in. I'm going to thank you. And Johanna's going to talk with you in a brief moment. But I want to just highlight one quick thing. Firstly, my mind is blown, because you were able to articulate everything in ways that I think I have been trying to deal with for over a decade. But I just wanted to highlight one point that I think I'm going to think about for a really long time. Is you said the cultural value of abuse of the film industry is consistent with the stories the film industry has wanted to tell. So it's all intertwined.
Yeah.
So I'm going to thank you again and leave you for a conversation with Johanna. Thank you for your work. I am very much looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah,
Hi.
thank you so much, Karen. Hi from me as well. That has been so interesting to listen to, and yeah, I have so many questions. But I'm going to start with a reflection. I think it's very interesting. You really put your finger on something there with this idea of who matters more. This the worth that this certain type of man is creating in an artistic or an economic system. And we do have this idea. In Sweden, we've talked about the culture man, but in different countries, this has come out in different ways. The male genius. The auteur, of course, in our industry as an object, but also the mogul, who is a kind of auteur of business, right? As an object of cultural and financial worth. And we know, of course, that this goes back to a 19th century idea, like this whole idea of the artist as separate from the craftsman. Has a deep history in sort of Eurocentric or quote unquote Western art, and I think that has shaped how we think about these artist men in the film industry as well. And what's so curious to me about that is that idea of being an artist, what the quality is that you need to have talent, it's kind of magical quality that can come like sort of from the earth or from God or from the folk or from the ground, and you have to have intuition to be able to shape it, and then combined with discipline and grit and ruthlessness and daring intellect and these kinds of things. But this irrationality, which is not in our culture typically coded as a male virtue, is permitted fully with these artists men. I mean, because these artist men, they are so emotional, they can't they can't control their impulses. That's what we're saying when we're saying that it's to be expected. And I wonder if you wanted to reflect on this idea. What is an artist? And then how do we think about what is a female artist, or what is an artist who is not like this?
I think that's a really good point. I also don't think I think it plays out in a specific way when we're talking about film. And I think there's a language that's used to talk about artists in the film industry that particularly opens up this. I also don't think it's specific to the film industry. I think the specific language that's used might be different, but the ideas underpinning it are typically the same, which are that male behaviour is legitimated because men are the ones in power who are deciding the terms on which these decisions are made. So if I can just give you an example from my field, I'm an academic, and I remember attending, just as I was starting, just before this story broke actually, I was attending a seminar on funding in academia, because that's where it's at. We've got to know where to get our funding. And some male colleagues gave this presentation where the final slide that they showed was of Kevin Spacey in House of Cards. This was before the story of Anthony Rapp spoke out and others. And the caption was don't take no for an answer, never take no for an answer. And I wasn't very impressed by this, partly because the stories in House of Cards, of course, legitimate a particular, so to use that as a model, however ironically they intended it, I think was really problematic. But that phrase, don't take no for an answer, it's used endlessly in academia, it's used in business, it's used, and it normalizes not taking feedback, not listening to others. It normalizes individualism. And it's something I think we really need to try and be conscious of and resist. I'm sure it's a phrase I've used endlessly, and it was just them putting it in that context which made me kind of see red. And that's part of what I think this whole thing's about. It involves all of us reflecting on what we've accepted and what we've taken for granted. And that process isn't easy. Let's not kid ourselves.
When you said that it normalizes not listening, I noticed in my body, I felt provoked. I thought, well, of course, I can't, if I'm a creator, if I am a creative, I have to create also, I have to have a space that is mine. Like, it's hard enough to get a room of one's own, and now And now I also have to listen to everybody, but I also know, of course, this is an internalized thing. Of course, I know that is not what you're saying at all. I understand that what we're saying is that, and I mean, literally this morning, I myself gave a talk at this conference where I talked about the enormous artistic power and financial power in listening to our audience. So and our collaborators of diverse voices. So, but even in myself, that is how deeply this is internalized.
But I think we can use different ways. We can challenge ourselves to think about different ways of saying these things. That's kind of what a lot of this is about. And sometimes it can seem like a real luxury. Look, why does it matter how we talk about these things? It really doesn't matter. What matters much more is that there are services for survivors in place, that women have access to funding to tell their own stories. And of course, all of those things are fundamentally important. And, material change is essential. But I'm bound to say this as someone who does media studies, but, changes in representation don't only follow changes in reality, they can also lead the way. So if we can change the way we think about things, the stories that we promote and the language we use to talk about them, then I think that is part of this bigger picture. It's an activist act.
I think in the Nordic countries where we are very state oriented, I think there has been a rhetorical shift or attempt at least to frame this when we're looking at solutions and paths forwards to shame sexual harassment also and at film shoots, for instance, as a workplace safety issue. And we have pretty good work safety legislation and saying, no, obviously workplace harassment is unacceptable and we already have ways of dealing with this. And there is a kind of, again, this kind of gut reaction resistance to that, because it's where people think, yeah, but like even female filmmakers are saying, yeah, but I mean, it's not a normal workplace. It's not your random workplace. And what we mean by that is that there is a romance also to the process of creativity, where if you try to put it in a box of procedure and law, somehow that would make the art less powerful. And I think in this particular context, it's just like, I don't think, if you have good catering, that is also maybe not artistically required, but I'm pretty sure that it makes people work better on set. So it doesn't have to be any more or less romantic than just like having catering for people's special diets on set or something like that. But there is, of course, this idea still that we are also romanticizing our industry from the inside. And that's one of the reasons many of us got into this to begin with, to be somewhere special that is not, an office.
But many industries or sectors romanticize themselves in that way. And in Scotland, earlier this year, we just went through a very high profile sexual assault trial where our former First Minister, Alex Salmond, was on trial on 14, then 13 accounts of sexual assault, including attempted rape. Now, he was found not guilty or not proven, which is a Scottish specific verdict. But actually, a lot of the discussion around that case mirrored exactly what you've just said. But you've got to understand that in politics, this is the way it is. In politics, we have to allow for these kinds of working conditions. We have to allow for this kind of speech. We have to understand the normal rules don't apply. So if they don't apply in politics and they don't apply in film, where do they apply? Which sectors do these normal rules apply to? Why are we always creating these special cases? I think is something we need to be alert to or drill down into a bit.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think also it's worth, I could immediately think of all kinds of sectors where work is very different from, like, I don't know, childcare. There are many work environments where our social interactions are very physical or very different from around like an arbitrary factory or office situation, or where we have very intense work or very long hours, and we are able to figure out rules for doing that appropriately just fine. So of course there's no reason but I think these are the kind of rhetorical traps that we end up in ourselves. You did say something very important about power distribution here, and I guess that, of course, you're absolutely right, and it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it at all. That all this historical, the historical movement to advocate for victims has been largely invisible in this debate. At the same time, the fact that we're even having that MeToo was possible surely is a consequence of all of that activism. And when people say, but well, this is very important, but public shaming is not the answer. Yeah, but we got to the point of public shaming because private shaming didn't help. Either we didn't do the private shaming, because, you know, we have to hold ourselves accountable, or it was those of us who tried to move within the existing systems didn't get any kind of result from it. And we have come to a point where sexual harassment is unacceptable, even though it is still possible. And now I think something has shifted. I don't know if you agree.
I do. The optimistic me does. The pessimistic me sometimes doesn't and thinks we've got a long way to go. But I think that question really about where the voices of activists been in this is really important. And I just want to offer one quick anecdote about this. I work with a number of organisations in Scotland that are frontline services supporting victims and survivors. And when I've talked to them about the media response to MeToo, one of the things they've reflected on is the media went to them for a response when it became a story about has MeToo gone too far. So they didn't go to them as experts who could give evidence about what survivors had experienced. They didn't go to them at that stage in the story. They went to them when it was a story where they could pit women against women, saying, has MeToo gone too far? And that is part of the problem. We're not hearing those voices. We're not seeing that longevity. And that puts the onus endlessly on individuals to speak out. And as I say, I would never detract from the value and importance of that speech, but it should never be mandated. It should never be an imperative. And enough people have spoken out that we need to be able to listen to that and move forward.
Yeah, I guess that this does make me think, you know, we have always said, or at least since second generation feminism, we've said the personal is political. But there's something problematic with that language, right? We talked this morning about that we say nobody is free until everyone is free, but we don't quite mean everyone. And with the personal is political, I guess in a way it's like, yeah, but it's not like, yeah, but how political, or like it's not hard politics, or that there's something, there's that tension there, that it's always in the end just these personal stories, because we have to talk about structures, right? And that's where it gets uncomfortable. How do we? I mean, because if you're looking at this, I guess who the perpetrators are, it's very easy to make it a question only of gender. But when we're looking at in rare cases the perpetrators are women, and then it's also a function of power, and how power is expressed in our culture. So then that means we have to redistribute power, and for media that is a very uncomfortable narrative. Suddenly then they have to be all aboard with the feminist agenda.
That sounds good.
Yeah, no, I'm all for it, but can we achieve that?
I want to reflect briefly on that personal is political. There's a really interesting book about what happened when women said incest. It's called Rocking the Cradle of Sexual Politics. It came out in the 90s by Louise Armstrong, and she's talking in that book about what it was like to be a survivor. She refers to herself as the first living, breathing incest survivor, because the media suddenly took up her story. There was lots of interest. And she makes what to me is one of those quotes that just stays in my mind, that she says that once the story got taken up by the media, that slogan of the personal is the political was deformed to become the personal is the personal. So they wanted endless personal stories, but the next step was not there. And when feminists started organising speak outs or consciousness raising sessions in the 70s, and of course that goes further back in other movements as well, they weren't asking people to speak out for the sake of speaking out. They were using those personal stories to build a political analysis. And that's the step we lose too often in a media narrative that's really caught up with that idea of the personal. And Tarana Burke, I think, has reflected on that really powerfully, that the media want her personal story. They want her to be a founder, but it's like all the work she's done in the, 14 years since MeToo was founded has, that's not what they're interested in. They're not interested in that graph. They're not interested in that work. They're interested in that personal story of survival, of, starting something, but not seeing it through. So yeah, I'd like more stories of seeing it through.
We have a little bit extra time, so if you have a few more minutes, I'd like to ask you about that. I'm wondering about this because you're putting it very delicately, but we're entering on an issue of white feminism here, and I guess in the responses to me too, I feel like I've seen, at least here in the Nordic countries that I followed more closely, also tensions between different generations of feminisms. And I think even in the introduction of the book, you say, well, perhaps there's a fourth generation of feminism, perhaps there isn't. Maybe you could touch a little bit on that and see how effectively or not the different feminisms have been working together here, generational and otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. I would certainly not want to gloss over the extent to which there's tension and disagreement. I mean, feminism, Bell Hooks puts this brilliantly when she says that feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation and oppression. And I think that idea of movement too often gets lost, because movements have to move, they have to change, they have to adapt, they have to learn. And, that process won't always be easy. And I'm certainly not romanticizing, say, the 70s and the work of the 70s in terms of when many of these say rape crisis centres in my context in Scotland were set up. But I also don't want to lose their contributions, because if we lose their contributions, we start from scratch. And we also need to be really careful that we don't just think it's the 70s and now, because, in Scotland, for instance, Rape Crisis was founded in the 1970s, so was Scottish Women's Aid. They have not stopped ever since. They've been, we have got 4 decades more of people who have been doing this work on the front line, and I want to learn with them. I don't want to dismiss their knowledge. I want to learn with them. How we make that truly intersectional is a really, really important point. But I just wanted to pick up on this idea of Me Too as white feminism, just really briefly, because one of the things that frustrated me when I was writing the book about Me Too was that critique was usually a critique of the mainstream media story about Me Too. So the mainstream media story about Me Too was a story about white feminism. It was a story about celebrities. It was a story about, actors. But actually the work that was going on in social media under the hashtag Me Too was not that. There were people globally using this hashtag to tell their stories. So I think we've got to be a bit careful about claiming that the movement was about white feminism, when that's what the story the mainstream media chose to tell about the movement. And then we can all think about, okay, so how can we make that movement different? How can we amplify different voices within it? Which I think is an important question. And one of the things that social media enables, if we don't like the story, we can to an extent change it.
Yeah.
Not fully, but we can to an extent.
And I guess one thing that does strike me here is also that the generations of feminism are not inevitable, but there tends to be a progression. And there's that very familiar William Gibson quote where he says that the future is already here, is just unevenly distributed. And I often think of it in reverse, that the past is also here, is just unevenly distributed. And when we're thinking about activism on a global scale, we don't have to go further than to EU countries even to see that the most basic rights of women and sexual minorities, gender minorities are threatened. Abortion rights are threatened everywhere, and so on. And there are so many countries in the world that have no rape crisis centers at all. And certainly there are still places where women, don't have democratic representation. And of course, so then you have to start at sort of zero. And that means that none of the work historically, is wasted. At the same time, we have to question the efficiency, as you're saying. If we in countries where we have had rape crisis centers since the 70s, and the only real effect, apart from some support to individual victims, is that reporting prevalence has gone up, but we don't think that the structures have changed at all. Then it's not working. Then we need to do something else as well.
I would be slightly more. I agree and disagree on that point.
Okay.
I think in some ways I would be slightly more optimistic. When I look back at the work that was done in the 70s, and I read women's accounts of trying to seek refuge in the 1970s, for instance, things have changed to an extent. They have not changed fully, but the services are there, and we should never, ever, I think, minimize how important those frontline services are. They save lives. They literally save lives. And they weren't there 40, 50 years ago in my country, and they aren't there in some places now. So let's not forget that. I mean, we are talking about saving lives here.
Oh, for sure. And they cannot be defunded, even though that is a constant.
But that's a really important point, that, there is sometimes, I think, a complacency about it now, right? We've done that. We did that a while ago. We're sorted now. We don't have this problem. And certainly in my context, there's a lot of defunding of these organizations, or just the sense that they don't don't have continuous funding, and they continually have to fundraise for everything. And a really, really striking disjuncture there that hit me was, I mentioned Alex Salmond earlier, our former First Minister. When the charges were first laid against him, he launched a crowdfunder for his own defence. And within, I can't remember, the figures might be slightly wrong here, but it was within something like 24 hours, he raised £60,000 or something like that.
Yeah.
At the same time, later, Rape Crisis were trying to raise £16,000 during the 16 days of action to fund vital services. And that took them like weeks and weeks and months, and they managed to raise £16,000. And then you've got this man in a position of huge power who can raise that money like that. So,
and I think that again, like Paul said, I mean, we're going to have to end here, but I think that again reminds us that the thing that MeToo made visible is that this problem is everywhere, and what we've talked about is again that how unevenly it hits the victims. And yeah, we're going to have to change it. Thank you so much for taking the time, Karen. This was super interesting, and I'll let Melissa come back on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Mute. Karen, thank you. I cannot wait to read your book. I need to get myself a copy of it. Thank you, Johanna, for that great conversation. And so up next, I'm going to have a conversation with Laurence Lascary, who is one of the co-chairs of Collective 50/50 in France. Laurence, are you there? She started a production company, DACP. My American accent, I cannot say the name of the company properly. It's going to sound awful. So it's DACP, to take the heat out of debates about the working class areas and remove inhibitions of their residents to show them it's possible to succeed. In 2011, she launched the Young Independent Producers Day. I think that's the English definition, an innovative marketplace dedicated to the new actors of the audiovisual industry. She's a next generation rabble rouser over there. In 2018, Laurence received the title of Chevalier in the National Order of Merit for her contribution to the French film industry. And she is now engaged in the Collective 50/50, and she is the co-chair. And we will tell you, hi, Laurence, nice to see you, about the Collective 50/50. I want to just tell people my first experience working with the collective was preparing for the 2017 March up the steps at the Cannes Film Festival. Cannes, for those of you who go or don't know, has been like really just horrifically awful about female representation. And my French colleagues and friends and fellow rabble rousers decided to do something about it. And that moment is going to be a moment of significant history as to when people started to pay much more attention to the lack of opportunities for women at these like top tier film festivals. And so I thank you all for your work, and welcome, Laurence. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Melissa.
So let's talk a little bit about what you think that the collective, was able to accomplish. France has notoriously been a country that has not been receptive to these conversations and these movements. And when Me Too happened, even some of the leading French actresses were like, oh, no, it's not real. So how were you able to get some of that momentum going on the collective?
The collective is a do think. So I would say that the way we did to activate change and to eliminate inequalities was to have, with having a pragmatic approach by collecting data and then asking for change. And it was very efficient because no one can contest, no one can deny data. And when you have the figures, it's more easy to demand a change. And also, I think the power that resides within the collective is the number of people involved, and also our ability to represent a very wide range of the industry, from the ground to the very the toppest level. For instance, we discussed with the French Ministry of Culture, we discussed with the French Film Office. We have very well-known filmmakers that are part of the founders of the collective, and they were able to provide their fame, their power, in order to claim for change. But when I think of Céline Sciamma or Rebecca Zlotowski, they didn't need the change for themselves, because they're very high paid, and they're able to make films every year, and they're in a place of power, and they use that power in order to help to empower the filmmakers or the professionals that were in need, and that didn't have the same voices. And
Right.
so
yeah, keep going. Sorry.
how we did is in 2018, when we did when we climbed the steps of the festival, it was part of the strategy. So there was the communication part of it, which was this beautiful picture of 82 women on the stairs with all the women of the jury, Kate Blanchett, Eva DuVernay, and so forth, and also our great Agnès Varda, and who gave a very powerful speech. And at the same time, we worked with the organizer from the festival, all sections, the main competition, week of the critics, and all the 4 main sections. We worked with them on a festival pledge. So they in the pledge, basically, they said that they are going to monitor and to collect data on the amount of women that send their film to the festival, and the amount of films directed by women that are picked to be part of their selections. And also they commit themselves to have as many women and men within the committee, the selection committee. So parity within the selection committee, parity within their board, and also collection of data. So it's very, it's not a cosmetic pledge. It's very, it's a huge, it's a strong commitment.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about their commitment. I know we didn't have a festival this year, and I worked with, Delphine on the pledge, and we were trying to collect data. And one of the issues that we have about collecting data, particularly in Europe, is that people don't track race. Like, so, and I know that's, a bugaboo issue that we bring up, which is like, here in the US, like we are just like, we can ask that question, gender and race. And for my colleagues in Europe, that was something we had to actually, have 2 different pledges. And so as we move towards being a more intersectional movement, that's something that has to be dealt with. But I know that there are kind of larger issues in the countries about asking hard questions like that. So I really want you to talk a little bit about how we're able to get better data.
We don't collect data in France, but I can tell that I'm the only Black woman in the room most of the time, and most of for the past decade during my professional journey. Now I'm used to be the only Black woman in the room. That being said, it's true that this is our biggest challenge. The collective has been has wanted to be intersectional from its very beginning. That was very important to the movement. But still, after having worked on that matter for the past 2 years almost, my conclusion is that the change won't come from the political power, because the French system is stuck. We don't have, we are not really able to tackle racial inequalities without data. It's very difficult to have a conversation about race in France, and it's in most of European countries actually. And what we've done, because we've tried to, you have to picture that it's a big deal brainstorming on how we are going to avoid those barriers. And most of the work that you put on is to figure out how you will be able to find solution, because this is what we do in the collective, and to avoid the fact that the constitution, the law, provide you to collect data. You can, some researchers have done surveys and work, but it's very tortuous. So, and we in the collective, we try to find the most efficient way to get short-term results. So what we did so far is that we've worked on a pledge, another one, to federate the profession from all our unions, producers, actors, screenwriters, casting agents, all the widest, the most cross-section representation of the industry. So they signed this pledge, and basically it's about changing their practices, how they for instance, how do you what the words you use when you're casting director and you are looking for a talent, the way you're going to show that you are open to any race and any profiles for that world. So you need to advertise them, because otherwise, if you don't, the actors will assume that it's for white. If it's not, if you don't write, if you don't say that we are looking for Black or for Asian or for diverse, it's open. If you don't say it, they won't come to your casting. So this is an example, and inclusion is also behind the camera. And what we have proposed to the producers is to work with nonprofits that are able to scout for young people from disadvantaged communities, because in France it's very mixed. When you talk about race, you also talked about social inequalities, and this is allowed. So this is how we do. It's not the equivalent, but this is one of the solutions that we have in France. And also, we published a directory to put the light on the talents and the professional technicians.
Like a database.
Yes, a database.
Okay, we'll get the link to that. I'm going to have to wrap it up, but in just a quick moment, what would be the one thing that you wanted to share with people who are trying to do the work that you did and with the collective and that you're working on? What would you like impart to other people who are on this journey?
What I would say is that you have to be you have to be versatile. You have to be able to talk to the government. You have to be able to talk to the institutions, but at the same time, you have to implicate the private sector, studios, because the change has to come from everyone, and you have to cultivate the change of culture. You have to fight the toxic environment and to make your ideas mainstream. And even if it's not going as fast as the US in France, but at the same time, have noticed the improvement in terms of parity. So now we need change for the other section of discrimination.
I don't feel it's going very fast here, but it's good for you to say that. I just wanted to let people know that Dame Heather from Time's Up UK was supposed to join us and she was unable to it. So I thank you for leading this conversation. And Laurence, I know it wasn't supposed to be that way, but it was a wonderful conversation. And I thank you and all your colleagues at the collective for being on the forefront of this and leading us all into the future.
And thank you so much, Melissa, for all your help from the very beginning.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thank you.
You too. Okay,
so up next, are we ready to rock to the next conversation? I believe we are. Okay, so let me get to my next conversation. All right, so my colleague Wendy Mitchell is going to do a conversation with, with Ida O'Brien, who is the UK's leading intimacy coordinator and founder of Intimacy on Set. Her company set up in 2018, and it provides services to TV, film, and theater when dealing with intimacy and sexual content and nudity. Ida pioneered the role of intimacy coordinator, and since 2014 has been developing best practices and on-the-set guidelines, which have been widely adopted in the industry and championed by the Time's Up movement. I just want to say something about Ita. I remember seeing Ita at Cannes, and you were coming around and you were like, Melissa, and you were like talking about intimacy, and I had literally no clue what you were talking about. So I am indebted to you for leading us on this journey. And basically there's a new industry now, a new job, and you have created it. So you are a pioneer.
Thank you.
Anne Choma is also joining us. She's the author of Gentleman Jack, The Real Anne Lister, the official companion book to the amazing 2019 BBC HBO drama Gentleman Jack. I believe we're getting a second season on that too. She first began reading and transcribing Lister's diaries in 1992, going on to do further research as a postgrad at the University of Leeds in 1994. In her capacity as lead consultant to Sally Wainwright, who is like top of the tier for me on the drama, Anne continues to play an important role in driving global attention to Lister's extraordinary life and work. And she was recently listed in the top 100 Pride Power list of 2020. Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for being here. I loved that show. I cannot wait for the second season. And Wendy, take it away.
Great.
Have a great conversation.
Melissa. Thanks, Melissa, for introducing our guests. Yes, we're going to be looking at intimacy on screen in this talk. I'm thrilled to have Ida and Anne here. Melissa's already introduced them quite well, but just to mention some of Ida's recent shows are, gosh, this is the best of the year. I May Destroy You, Normal People, Sex Education, Watchmen. You'll see she's in a hotel room, isolating before doing a big shoot in Ireland, I believe.
That's right.
And yeah, you know, Anne Choma has been studying Anne Lister for more than 30 years. It's just amazing, her research. And I'd like to, you know, Ida, I love that, yeah, as we heard about intimacy coordination in Dorte's talk, in Karen's talk, and that goes to show that people are paying attention to this now. And I feel like I've read more articles about you this year than I've read about Brad Pitt. And isn't that wonderful? We don't need more articles on him. So yeah, it's been great to see the attention. But I wanted to start with Anne just telling us, some people might not have seen Gentleman Jack, so they might not really know who Anne Lister is. So could you give us a little primer for people who haven't heard of her yet, and why her diaries, all 24 volumes of them, are so unique? So welcome, Anne. You'll have to unmute yourself, or somebody will unmute you. Maybe?
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Nice to meet you, Wendy. Hi, Ita.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing? Anne Lister was a Yorkshire woman, and she lived at Shibden Hall in West Yorkshire, Halifax. And she was a diarist. She was an industrialist. She developed her own coal pits on her land. She was an extensive traveller, but she's famous for her diaries. She wrote 27 volumes of diaries, around 5 million words. What makes her diaries extraordinary today is that they are written in the first person, and they give us an extraordinary account of a lesbian life lived in the early 19th century. So, and in 2011, the diaries were recognised by UNESCO as a pivotal document, and really a literary masterpiece. Gentleman Jack covers Anne's life, a section of Anne's life. And so the momentum has grown since Gentleman Jack about Anne's, Anne and her adventures amongst fans worldwide.
So how did Gentleman Jack, the TV show, did Sally Wainwright, who is just, as Melissa said, a sort of goddess of modern TV, did she come to you? Did you know her already? How did the show come about, and when were you involved in it?
Sally and I were friends. We had been friends for many years, and there's a long Anne Lister history of research prior to Gentleman Jack, with Helena Whitbread and Jill Liddington, significant historians in the Anne Lister story. And so we all knew each other, and I knew Sally around 2000. Sally kindly approached me at the beginning. So the research had already begun on Gentleman Jack, and then she approached me to start transcribing the diaries for her. And eventually that morphed into me being Sally's advisor on set and consultant. So originally there was many years ago, there was a project to try and transcribe all of Anne's diaries, all 5 million words of them. And Sally was involved in that, I was involved in that, amongst other people. And so our friendship cemented at that point, and just continued. And we both shared an obsessive love of Anne Lister and all things Anne Lister. So our friendship grew from that, and it seemed like a natural, we'd come full circle when Sally had started writing Gentleman Jack, that we started working together on that, and it's been, a wonderful collaboration.
Great. And I should mention that Sally sends her love to everybody at Carla, but she's traveling right now and couldn't actually take part physically, but wanted to very much supported the conversation. Because we're talking about intimacy, even if she wrote something about a lover in her diary, did she intend for the public to read that? She was being very open and about her sexuality?
Well, I mean, the diaries were written for, I believe the diaries were written for her and for nobody else. I mean, anything she didn't want anybody to see, she would write in a secret code. And anything that, that she felt might have been seen, or people might have read the diaries by taking a sneaky look at them, would have been written in code, so she wouldn't have revealed the most innermost thoughts to people. They were secreted within this strange alphabet that she'd constructed. So for me, the diaries have always been only written for Anne Lister and for her purpose. But yes, she did write with great sort of explicitness about her sexuality, and about many other things as well. So we get from Anne Lister's diaries a first-person account of what it was like to love women sexually in the early 19th century. and in fact, you know, it will, you know, as you come on to talk to Ita, we'll talk about that level of intimacy that she described in great detail. I mean, Anne Lister drew the original sexual body roadmap, I believe, for herself. You know, she knew which bits of that roadmap to stop at and find pleasure in, and which bits weren't worth bothering about. So she was a liberated woman sexually.
Yeah, we should all be so lucky to do that today. When you're dealing with a historical person who is writing about their intimate moments in a code, is there any moral conundrum about then showing that on screen, you know, for her descendants to see, you know, if it wasn't something she was shouting about publicly, what right do modern people have to tell her story, including those intimate moments? How did you and Sally approach that?
I think, you know, 200 years after the event, it's kind of fair game to be able to share this kind of amazing history with the world. So I think for me, when I was writing the book, I did kind of have a little bit of a dilemma in terms of what I included in it. And, you know, in the introduction of the book the companion book that I wrote, there is a section there about, you know, Anne pleasuring herself in a way that she normally wouldn't have pleasured herself. And I thought, you know, should I include that? And I just thought, well, yeah, I really do need to include it. But, you know, Sally and I certainly had you know, again, we'll when we include Ita in the conversation in a minute, we had no qualms about sharing sexual content of Anne's life with the world, but we certainly wanted to do it tastefully. And, you know, we didn't want it to be gratuitous, and it had to have context within the wider arc of the storytelling in the drama.
Yeah. And yeah, I will say, when you watch the show, it doesn't look like blue is the warmest color. In one example of maybe a problematic depiction of lesbianism on screen. So Ida, I would love to bring you in and just hear your thoughts on how you wanted to ensure that there was a sort of respectfulness about the intimacy that you showed. And, you know, for both of you, this isn't, the typical male gaze on lesbians, and how you sort of configured that with Sally and with Anne.
That's right. Well, you know, obviously I first spoke with Sally and with Anne and read the scripts, but most importantly, and through Anne, being shared, you know, with the whole gamut of different translations of the diaries. And then going from her language, you know, the words that she used, that the evocativeness of those words that absolutely gave you the physical qualities that was needed. And then also making sure, what was also so incredible about Anne Lister was that, you know, she was completely clear and had no question about who she was and what her sexuality was. And that's right from, you know, from a child. She just knew herself, and then was uncompromising in how she presented herself in the world, knowing that it would mean that she'd get backlash. And that was some of the issues with the people that then, the other women that she was in relationship with that embraced the relationship with her. But then, you know, then it came to the question of, and will you stand up and stand next to me, presenting yourself in society, you know, with that honesty. And that's where then sort of many of the women couldn't do that. They needed to actually get married and continue that conventional life. So that was part of, or big part in just really honoring Anne Lister's energy, her, you know, and her love of life, her love of women, and then taking that all into the intimate content.
And specifically with this show, working with the actresses, can you talk about, you know, were there any especially tricky scenes or moments that you really wanted to ensure everybody felt safe and supported, and how did you do that?
We had an initial day before everybody went up to Yorkshire in London, where all the actresses who are going to be playing any of the intimate content, and Sally and Anne and myself and the director of the second block, having that conversation and laying out not just what the intimate content was, but how we were going to work. And also, wasn't it Anne, just really saying about how important it was that we were honouring the queer community and saying, you know, you know, has this happened before? A room of women honoring a woman of history, writing so beautifully about, you know, her sexual expression of her loving, and then making sure that we honored that. So I feel, and then we took that into each of the scenes. So I feel that day and that conversation and setting up that focus and setting up, looking at the details of Anne Lister's diaries. And as I said, the words like, you know, she had this thing about sort of pressing into someone and grubbling, and there were words like that that were so evocative, and then we could take into how we express that physically.
Mm. And I was thinking Ita that day, you know, when we were all in that room together, it was a really liberating, empowering day for us, wasn't it? For everybody involved. Just because, I mean, it was a room full of women talking about sex, and, you know, it just felt a very strong moment in the production, in pre-production of Gentleman Jack, that we were able to do that. And it just felt incredibly empowering. And I kind of remember the bit before that, where you and I the day before were sat in the park in Soho Square Gardens with the lesbian Kama Sutra book on our knee, looking, and you had the scripts with you, and we were going through each of the scenes, Ita, of the where sex was happening within Gentleman Jack, and you know, discussing how we felt they should be played out. And I think we took some of that to the meeting as well the next day, with Saran and Sophie and Lydia. So yeah, it was a really special day that we were able to do that.
And this might be a really dumb question, but I'm curious. In the early 1800s, was sex different? Was intimacy different? I mean, did you take a sort of historical, factual approach about what undergarments might have been ripped off in a certain way, or even just, you know, sexual acts where they didn't have, you know, porn on YouTube or anything to be watching? So was sex different, Anne?
Not really. I mean, it's all about giving pleasure, isn't it? And understanding your partner, and knowing what your partner likes. So Anne Lister was very good at taking the lead, and she was quite dominant as a lover, in terms of wanting to make sure that her women had as much pleasure and as many, what she would describe as kisses as possible. But it's interesting you mentioned the word porn, because, you know, Anne Lister used to read, I was thinking, I can just give you an example. Anne Lister would read Marshall's epigrams to Mariana Lawton, and that was kind of their version of porn. You know, she would source her titillation from, you know, from the classics.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of level of historic detail that really brings everything to life in terms of how it was for them at that point in time, as women loving women.
Yeah. And we've talked about this a little bit, and I wanted to mention that in block 4 today, we're going to be talking specifically about the queer gaze. But, you know, do you feel a special responsibility for either of you in how, you know, homosexual relations are displayed on screen compared to heterosexual, and, you know, especially a female gaze on two women? Can you talk a little bit about that, and just, you know, not perpetuating stereotypes, what we might think of as lesbians, how they have sex, and things like that?
Anne, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, as a gay woman myself, it's incredibly important to be able to see reality, you know, depicted on TV. And one of the comments that came after, you know, the series had transmitted from gay women around the world, that it was, for the first time, they felt represented in the way that the sex was portrayed, and how, you know, how it was different from what they'd seen on mainstream TV before. So that was massive. And we did want to, it was, you know, we talked about this, Ita, and we talked about it with Sally, that we wanted to be able to do justice for the LGBTQI community, and to give them something that they would remember as being a positive experience by seeing the sex on screen. So it was hugely important for us to get that right, and and we were very sensitive to all of that.
Yeah, likewise. That's absolutely, you know, my work is, or the development of the intimacy guidelines is absolutely, you know, from my journey as a musical theatre dancer, but then an actor myself, and absolutely, you know, all the intimate content is about taking that storytelling into the physical, you know, when that intimacy, you know, that frisson journeys through from text, then releasing it into the physical, and it's about telling storytelling through the physical intimacy. And for me, it was really important that we really honoured the queer community, that we got that journey right. And for me, the real shift of you know, it comes from, you know, with the queer female lovemaking, you know, from emotion, from relationship, from connection, from that heart place, you know, through into that intimate connection. And that was as much as important as physically what they actually did, was really, you know, that whole energy and the connection of those relationships through into the intimate content.
Yeah, and this intimate content is very clearly not just put there to titillate. It's there because it's part of the story.
Yeah.
And with that note, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of your other shows, Ida. We'll come back with Anne, and I should mention we're going to be taking audience questions. You know, in about 10 minutes we'll open. Well, questions are open now, so if you want to type it into YouTube down in the comments, go for it. We would love to have some questions, and I'm sure you're going to have some questions. But yeah, I think, you know, Normal People is another, gosh, you know, amazing show. And a lot of people are talking about it. And this, you know, I think for Connell and Marianne, sex is a huge part of their relationship. And that was a huge part of their relationship in the book that Sally Rooney amazingly wrote. And it's a big part of the show. So, you know, working with Normal People, can you talk about maybe the specific challenges of that? Because there is a lot of sex and a lot of nudity, but it's, again, it's not, you know, pornographic. It's not there extraneously. So could you talk about Normal People for a minute?
Well, that's right. Well, my sense is the difference with Normal People, in a way the same as with Anne Lister, that it comes from such a fantastic narrative and that substance and that beauty of Sally Rooney's writing. And equally, the way Sally Rooney writes, the detail that she gives and she brings into the descriptions of the intimate content. And then, you know, she herself is, you know, that's her intention with writing. You see something about that body, mind, spirit connection that these two people have with each other through, you know, through that intimate content that then perhaps they're not quite able to match in how they speak with each other, you know, when they're concerns about their emotions, and then how they relate sort of with their dialogue. And so all of us were, you know, really, I can say university, were in love with the book, and then were so aware of how inherently all the intimate content was absolutely integral to that ongoing storytelling, telling us something other about them that they couldn't bring in their, you know, when they were speaking to each other. And so all of us just set about making sure that was honoured, and then through the guidelines and through working with the intimacy coordination, then again, it means there's a professional structure, a process that really invites that agreement and consent, so that with all of us, Lenny's empowered as a director, his vision's listened to, we're all honouring Sally's writing, and then with that clear professional process, then really working openly with Daisy and Paul for them to be autonomous, empowered, being able to say really clearly, most importantly, what they're not happy with, so we can all work really freely with every word that they're comfortable with. And then that's what you see, creating free storytelling that really, you know, honors the you know, the narrative of these two characters.
And I'm just thinking back, you know, there's a lot of nudity. You know, we saw a lot of Daisy's body. We probably didn't see as much of Paul's body. You know, it seems to me we still have this imbalance that it's okay to show a woman's breasts 1,000 times and we don't see a penis on BBC One at a certain hour. How did you juggle the amount of nudity, and why was it important for her to be bare-breasted, to show this level of intimacy, I guess?
Well, first of all, I'd like to actually say that I actually think, particularly in this production, there was real focus on having parity of nudity. And actually, there were several times that that you see, you know, the character of Connell completely naked. There's a couple of times post-coital where he's just leaning on her, you know, one about, I think it's episode 6, and one again in episode 12, where he's just the naked body, flaccid penis, but really important to see that the male in repose. And then there's another time he's come out of the shower. And again, we really spoke to that with Lenny and Susie Lavelle, these most amazing and beautiful cinematographer. Their palette was to use the images of Nan Goldin and the color palette of Nan Goldin, and also the quality of her images, which is just that dropped, open, natural and normal presence with your lover in that degree of nudity. And that's what we look to capture. So it's interesting that you felt there wasn't that parity, because I really can tell you that, you know, I feel that that was a focus of the production and a focus from Lenny to say, let's have equal masculine and feminine nudity.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I had friends who were joking that they saw more of Daisy's boobs than they saw of, you know, anything else this summer. So I think I'm probably misremembering it. So I'm really glad. I do remember seeing his male body more than we usually see a male body. So thank you for that.
And you know, and then for you know, as I said, we put in place what are you comfortable with? Where's your yeses, but where's your no's? Daisy, you know, each person, and this is what's so important about the aspect of the intimacy guidelines, is we put in place that the structure and the process that asks for agreement and consent, and that's of touch, of simulated sexual content, and of nudity. And everybody has a different relationship with their body. Again, you know, shifting the narrative in the industry to say just because someone perhaps is not comfortable to be fully naked does not mean that they're not a brilliant actor, and they're not indeed the best actor for that job. And then the converse has happened. If someone is comfortable with their nudity, with their physicality, with their nakedness, then, you know, there's a, you know, that actress is able to work openly, professionally with that degree of nudity that's required. If it wasn't comfortable, it wasn't within her agreement and consent, then we would absolutely have worked in order to do the shots that you know, that respected that. And that's what we did in other aspects. You know, I tell you that the shots that, the times I would say, you know, they were saying, don't want to take, not necessarily Paul and Daisy, but other characters in the production, don't want to take, you know, want to keep my flesh-coloured shorts on throughout. I promise you would have thought that those scenes that both actors were completely naked. But again, it's about honouring their, you know, what their agreement and consent, and then working creatively with the camera angles with our amazing cinematographer.
Yeah, and I should say, I mean, it very much, I never thought it was gratuitous. It wasn't like, hey, if it was a story about a young law student trying to finish her exams, yeah, maybe you don't need to see the boobs so much. But this is a story of two young people very much falling deeply in love, and part of that is their physical relationship. So I get it. I didn't mean to be flippant about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I get that, but then it's interesting, isn't it, how, you know, I suppose it is our society with a naked breast. You know, for a man, he could be naked from the waist up, and that's just considered fine and normal, and there's no issue. But for a woman to be naked from the waist up, which means being naked breasted, again, there's a certain taboo about that. There's a taboo about the, you know, the female nipple. I think there's one point in the watershed that you can show a male naked nipple, obviously if a man's been naked from the waist up, but not a female, and, you know. So I think that's also interesting within our society, our comfortableness, our relationship with female nudity, and I also, you know, particularly from all the conversations we're having today, it goes with when it's been exploited, when it's been objectified or titivated, and not just there as, you know, just honouring the female or the male form.
I will be remiss if we don't talk about another. I mean, gosh. I don't know which is better, but we don't have to, they can both be equally top show of 2020. I May Destroy You with Michaela Coel. Again, a lot of intimate scenes, a lot of nudity. And there's one scene, just before we take the audience questions, I have to ask about, because it was so powerful to me. And I have to say, every period I've had since I've watched this scene, it sort of feels empowering. I think back, like Michaela Coel has this thing too, which is the scene that she's about to have sex. She's got a tampon in, she's menstruating, there's blood. Yeah, what was it like working on that scene with her? And I guess that was driven by Michaela's own idea that she wanted to show that.
So yes, it's Michaela's writing, you know, and it's, you know, what she included within the narrative. It tells you something more about, you know, Annabella and Biagio. And I was delighted when I read it. It's like, wow, this is just fantastic. And of course, I didn't have to talk Michaela through it, she'd written it. But when I spoke the actor, the beautiful Mawan, through the beats of that scene, and you know, because it starts first of all with she's wearing a tampon and a pad, and the actor's going, really, does this happen? Is this what women do? And I'm going, yes, if someone's got a strong flow. And so that detail, it was very exciting to have that detail in there, you know, and to not shy away from it. And also what was so important for me in Michaela's writing was the response of the male character, that he wasn't in disgust, you know, he actually was a reverse. He was curious and a sense of beauty, and that was so important. And I just think it needs to be shown, you know, as I said, half the world's population spend roughly 40 years of their life engaged in menstruating, you know, 12 weeks a year, roughly 480 weeks of half the population's life is engaged in our paraphernalia of menstruating. And yet, when do we see it? When do we normalize it? So I was honored and delighted to have worked with Michaela, but that scene in particular was just superb.
Yeah, I mean, she is such a powerhouse. And if anybody out there hasn't seen I May Destroy You yet, it's just magnificent. I would love to take a few of the audience questions because we've got some great ones coming in. The first is for Ida, just how did you start in this business? Because I think your background is acting and movement, and how did you become one of the first intimacy coordinators?
I truly feel I was just guided and blessed, and you know, it was an organic journey. I've danced. My mum was Irish. Well, I'm from an Irish Catholic background. My mum wanted me to do Irish dancing. There wasn't any, so I went to ballet. I trained as a ballet dancer into musical theatre. Had a 10-year career. Trained as an actor, 8-year career there. Did the MA Movement Studies at Central School of Speech and Drama, working as a movement teacher, movement director, and then I started creating and writing my own work. Put on my own play, and then I was taking that step further, devising a piece around the dynamic of abuse in our society. And in that process, I was looking at what practices and principles do I need to put in place to make this work in a present, open, conscious way with best practice with my actors. And that ended up developing into the guidelines. And then when Weinstein, when the MeToo and Time's Up movement happened, I'd already developed the process of the intimacy onset guidelines, and I was there ready to go. Look, here is now how we work with professionalism, with autonomy, with best practice, with the intimate content, putting in place respect for all.
And can people access those guidelines from your website, or are they sort of private, or where?
Absolutely, they're deliberately there out in the world. And I'm journeying through getting them translated as well. There's a few different translations, including Swedish and Spanish, but I'm gradually working through. So it's on the Intimacy Onset website. And if you go to the page that's Intimacy Onset Guidelines, please take them, read them, print them out. You know, I say to actors or directors, don't just say they're there, take them, read them, and yes, and then work through them. And it just gives that guide to allowing everybody, as I say, just that shift where there wasn't an idea of needing to have a professional structure, and indeed the idea that actually it's we need professional skills. It is a body dance. There are two people moving together in a rhythm, just like a choreographer. We're bringing that sense of choreography, where to hold, you know, so that we can be detailed and precise and really honoring the storytelling.
Yeah, thank you. So Intimacy Onset website, you can find those guidelines. Yeah. And there's another question that's come through, sort of what more, other than sort of looking at these guidelines, trying to implement them on your own productions, what more can we do to protect actors too? It's not just women who can feel uncomfortable and feel unsafe. You know, we heard Dorte speaking very passionately about what she had experienced, and I'm sure a lot of that still goes on. What can we do? What more can we do?
So I'm really glad you said that. I feel the last big Me Too is all that the young men, older men who equally have been harassed and abused and really seriously have long-term ripple effects of that abuse. The two most vulnerable people that I have come to my workshop were two middle-aged men who had experienced abuses in their 20s, and that was still affecting them. So that the overall tenets of the guidelines is, first of all, open communication and transparency. Yeah, so everybody, producers, directors, actors, right from the get-go, if there's intimate content there, talk about it. I say to directors, before the audition stage, consider what you want. Things can shift and change, but be prepared to have that open conversation, and then putting in place that structure of agreement and consent. Yes, no assumptions, and invite the positive no. Yes, invite your actors no, so that we can all work freely and professionally with the yes, and then just to know, you know, to bring a structure to the intimate content, choreograph it clearly, which then allows your actors to be free to really bring all of their skills as an actor to the intimate content, giving you the best work possible.
Great, and a question coming in for Anne, just about the queer gaze. And this is, you don't have to speak on behalf of the whole queer community, but yeah, what would you like to see representation of LGBTQIA people evolve on screen?
Well, I think it's, you know, in terms of like working with ETA, it's all about transparency, isn't it? And today we're so much more open about sex and the way we talk about sex. And I think it's about honouring, certainly for Anne Lister, it was honouring her life in the most truthful and honest way we could. She was a lesbian living in the early 19th century, and we wanted to do justice to her. And so that was the premise that we went by for Gentleman Jack. But I think we just need to do more of the same, and we need to be able to talk about sex, to be free about how we feel about our own bodies, and to represent communities in the way that they want to be represented on TV and on mainstream TV. And I think going forward for series 2, that's certainly what we'll be doing. And you know, it's a great plus for us that from Gentleman Jack we got so much positivity from it, and that was because we had these free conversations about sex and about what people felt comfortable with. And I think that's what came through Sally, through Sir Anne's, and through Sophie's performance, and the intimacy they enjoyed with each other, and with Lydia Leonard, who played Mariana Lawton, and how we depicted those intimate scenes. And they spoke to those scenes spoke to lesbians around the world. I could say that it was all because it was women involved. I mean, you know, we had ETA, we had Sally directing, we had, you know, obviously women playing women, lesbians. I was the female consultant on set who happened to be a lesbian. So all these things have a huge impact in the way something is going to be, how something is going to look in the final cut. But I think, yes, I mean, that's how I feel about it, and I hope it continues to be like that for future series, and for any show, any film, any drama that has LGBTQ characters in it.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really wonderful point to end on, and I think I'm hearing from both of you. You know, one of the most important things is listening.
Yeah.
You know, listening to the people who are making the production, listening to the communities that you're representing, listening in a personal way, in a professional way. So really, thank you for the work you're doing, the shows you've created, just amazing work. So I do encourage anybody who hasn't seen I May Destroy You, Normal People, of course, Gentleman Jack, we have to go back and watch that to be ready for season 2. When will season 2 be made? Maybe, well, gosh, it's hard to predict production right now, isn't it?
It is. We're hoping to start filming, you know, in a few months' time.
Okay.
All being well, COVID, you know.
Yeah,
it's COVID, of course, but yeah, we're hoping
screens maybe next year or so. Best of luck with it, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about intimacy on screen. Yeah, again, thank you for your pioneering work, both of you, and I'm going to hand back over. Hello, New York.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now it's getting to be a decent hour here. Thank you, ETA, Anne, and Wendy, for such a great conversation. I mean, ETA, you are pioneering the world that we are all living in now. This is the present, the future, and vitally important. And so just thank you for all your work.
Thank you.
And
Well, And Melissa, as you said, from meeting you in 2018, wasn't it, at Cannes, thank you also for your pioneering and the support of Time's Up UK and Time's Up in America. So you have been so instigatory and in supporting the work. So thank you as well.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Stay safe in that hotel room until you go on to the show that you're waiting for. What show is it?
Oh, I can't say. I can't
Oh, busted. Okay. Well, you'll let us know when we can know. So, everybody, what is happening next is that you're going to watch a conversation that I had earlier this week with Tori Amos, the singer-songwriter, on demand. And so that is a link in your YouTube. You should watch that now and then come back here at the top of the hour, and Victoria Thomas will be guiding you through block 3. So thank you for staying with me for block 2 and being your hostess and moderator, and I will see you all later in the day. Thank you very much.
See you
Thank
later.
you.
And
Bye.
lovely to see you, Anne.
Yes, you too, Ita. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Bye-bye.